Hello and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to look at evaluating expressions inside of JavaScript and look at conditionals. So I've thrown my debugger statement right here and I've clicked upon the conditionals in JavaScript. So I'm only running those 9 tests right now. And you can see that the ones are grayed out. So when I reload the page, it's going to throw on the debugger. Most of this stuff should be familiar at this point. If we ask if 3 is equal to 3, either in a truthy or a strict equality comparison, we know that's going to be true. Likewise, we know that string 3 is loosely equal to number 3. We know that 4 is less than 5 and 5 is greater than 4. So all those are going to check out just fine. So our first example of a comparison is right here on the if statement. The if statement will only execute the block of code, and a block is anything in between these opening and closing curly braces. It will only execute it if the statement is true. So we start off with the variable we call bool. We set it equal to false. Then if 3 is equal to 3, which we expect to be true, that boolean is going to be set equal to true. So we can see that happen right there. So we expect bool is going to be equal to true, and of course it is. Next, we're going to look at the else if clause, and the else if clause runs the same way the if statement does. So if evaluates a condition, else if says, if that condition isn't true, then run the else if statement. So x is equal to 10 and bool is going to be equal to undefined. So here we say if x is equal to 9, then bool is going to be false. That statement never runs. So bool is still equal to undefined. Then it says, well, if that's not true, then evaluate if x is equal to 7 and set bool equal to false. Bool is still undefined because that statement is not true. Finally, we see that else if x is equal to 10 runs, that's going to set boolean equal to true. So at the very end of this, we expect bool to be equal to true. Next, we have the if, else if, and else statement. The else statement is not required to have an else if statement. You can simply do a if else statement. But here is all 3 of them. And this is done to make sure that you can test multiple conditions and have a failback condition. And likewise, you can have an if and an else if with no else, but you must have at least an if statement. So if 4 is equal to 5, bool is going to be false, and of course that isn't true. The next statement, else if 5 is equal to 4, isn't true either. And then since both those conditions are false, the else statement is going to execute. That's going to set bool equal to true, so thus we expect bool to be true, and that's going to evaluate to true. Next, we have what is known as the ternary comparison, ternary being a 3-part operator, and those 3 parts are the comparison, then what to do if that comparison is true, and then finally what to do if that comparison is false. The question mark separates the first, so here is the statement, and then here is the result if it's true, and then the colon separates the false statement. So here we have a string which has a length of, so if we run that, string.length, we can see it's going to be equal to 0. So we say if the string's length is greater than or equal to 8, then it's okay. Otherwise, we're going to say the string must be at least 8 characters long. So that's a way of doing a quick error message. And we expect that error message to equal string must be at least 8 characters long. Next, we have what are known as switch statements. And a switch statement takes a value, which is here going to be x, and then it's going to run through a series of case statements. So if x is equal to 1, it's going to do this. If x is equal to 2, do this. You can also compare strings like this, but you cannot use it to test complex conditionals. So note up here we have 5 is strictly equal to 4, and we have all sorts of other comparisons we can do. We can use OR statements and all sorts of other things. The switch statement can only test very simple things, so that's something to keep in mind. So conditional 1 is set to false, conditional true is set to false. And then we say if x is equal to 1, so in the case that it is 1, operate this conditional. The break statement has to be used with a switch in order to jump out of there. If you don't, it's what's known as fall through. and fall through can cause all sorts of problems if you're not careful. It's a very common source of bugs. So some programming languages like C# don't even let you do that, don't let you do fall through because they found it's just too prone to errors. Here though we allow it, so you saw that immediately it never evaluated the second case, it just jumped right out of there. So we expect the condition 1 to be true because it is right here. But since condition 2 was never run, that's going to still be equal to false. Next, we're going to look at what's known as the good form of fall through, and that's where we have just a bunch of case statements with a colon separating them. You can see that up here, case and a colon. And in this case, if x is 1, 2, or 3, any of those conditions are true, the entire conditional is going to be true and it breaks out of there. And we can see inside of there that once it hits that and it breaks out, the conditional is true, so this is going to pass. Next, we have the bad fall through. And this is what's known as chainable side effects. So we have multiple things occurring that we may or may not intend to. So x is going to be equal to 2, so it's going to pass this test. But notice there is no break statement, which is what's going to cause it to fall through. So now it's going to execute case 3, even though x is not equal to 3, conditional 2 is also going to be set to true. Douglas Crockford made a tool called JSLint, and someone asked him, send an email saying, hey, why don't you make it so that the switch statement without a break condition is an error? And he wrote back an email stating that, oh, this wasn't a problem and that it was okay. And then the next day he found a bug in his code. And when he investigated the source of the code, it was a switch condition without a break statement. And he said, man, how embarrassing is that I wrote this guy this big email stating that it wasn't a problem. And then the next day I find a bug in my code and it's the exact reason why. So this is generally a very bad thing to do and you should avoid it. Make sure you always put a break statement on there. So here in our fall through example, we got condition 1, which is going to be true, and condition 2, which may or may not be desirable to also be true. Next, just as the else condition will always make sure that there is a fallback, the default inside of a switch statement will execute if nothing is true. So this is what the default looks like. And when you're running the default condition, you don't need break because it's the last line of code that's going to execute. So it doesn't really matter. But as out of habit, I tend to put the break statement there just because it's better to have it than not. So x is equal to 1. The first case is 0, which never evaluates. So it immediately jumps to the default, which sets conditional 2 to be true. And then we can see the first conditional, which would have been true inside of this case, is false, but the second conditional is indeed true. So that's a look at all the different comparisons that you can do inside of JavaScript. You have the if, the else if, and the else block, and then you have the switch block. Then you have the ternary statement, which is kind of a shorthand version of the if else. In JavaScript, you don't see this nearly as much as you do in other programming languages, mainly because of the shorthand evaluation you can do with the or clause. This is typically how people use it. They set something equal to, then they check a condition, and then if that condition is true, they do block A, and if it's not, they do block B. But since you can use the or operator, you could just say error message equals string, or string must be at least 8 characters long, and that would work as well. So because of that shorthand evaluation, you don't typically see many ternary operators inside of JavaScript, but it still works. So that's been a brief look at comparisons inside of JavaScript.